Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Dana Coolbaugh. Today, I have me a very special returning guest, H.L. Tinsley. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Returning. I like that. It's good.
Yeah, I came up with it with because I was like, oh, actually your third time coming on. So, and I actually think other than I think you're actually my first guest that's returning for a third time. So that is a record that you hold right now, which is really cool. So that's really awesome. But thank you so much for coming on again.
No worries. I feel very privileged now.
No, that's awesome. So I'm just curious, what have you been up to since we last interviewed you back when your anthology, The Anatomy of Fear anthology, came out?
So much stuff. There's been a lot
Yeah, a
going
lot.
on. Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a lot, mostly behind the scenes over the last, I can't even think how long it's been since Anatomy came out. It was a good couple of months. So I've been, obviously, we brought Anatomy out. We did like the marketing campaign for that. That went really well. We got some great reviews. I was also kind of at the same time involved with Don McDermott's Advent of Winter. So that
Oh,
anthology came out as well. That has been making its way around the world. Actually, I've seen loads of photos on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram of
yep.
people receiving their copies. Absolutely stunning book. I do have a copy of it, but unfortunately, I haven't actually remembered to bring it with me. But that was a great project to be part of, really good fun. And I also wrote The Hallows, which is my most recent release, came out in March of this year, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit today. And I'm currently organising my first author event, which will be in September of this year, which is really exciting, and working on Vanguard 3 as well.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when I wrote out that question for the other day, I was like, man, I was like, Holly's been doing a lot. So I was like, that'd be really cool. I didn't realize that you were in with the Advent Rising though anthology, so that's like really, really cool. Or Advent Winter, sorry. I've been seeing that. I didn't realize what that was. I've been seeing that all over, like all over. So I can't wait to get my hands on that at some point really soon. It seems like everybody I know all of a sudden was like, oh, hey, and I was like, you could tell I've been busy the last couple of months because I had no idea. And I remember people talking about it, and then I just, the algorithm, and that's why I always want to tell people. I follow like all of you guys, right, that wrote in it, and that algorithm is pesky at times because if I'm not seeing, what you guys are, posting and talking about, like that's really vindicative of, I think, just the indie problem or just marketing in general, right? Because now everybody wants you to do those, the pay marketing ads, stuff like that. So I just thought it was just such a good example of how hard it is to market. Because I think I'm only not following, especially like on Instagram, maybe like two authors from that anthology, which is crazy to me. And I'm on like Instagram, doing my own thing like quite a bit. And I'll always go through, to, try and throw likes or comments, just to help other people like yourself with the algorithm and, things like that. So to me, it was just a crazy good example, of just that sometimes it's just not working for some people. But it was cool that I saw so many people now. It was almost like I got blitzed with it. And I saw literally like 30 people within the last 3 days post on Instagram alone. So I thought that was really cool that now I'm starting to see it again. But it was interesting to kind of have that gap. And I think that just really goes to show you that it's starting to get harder and harder, to advertise those things just organically on social media. But
Yeah, no,
um,
it's the bane of I think every author and indie creative's life at the moment. There's so many cool projects that I have missed from people who I love
yeah.
and adore and have been friends with for years, and they'll say, "Have you seen this?" And I'm like, "I haven't seen it. I'm so sorry." And it's it's generally not because I'm not looking. It's just the algorithms sometimes, like you say, they just aren't on the side of the authors, and it's it's really tough.
Well, I even think like the anatomy of like Fury anthology too. Like, I mean, I had seen when you guys again like first putting it together, and then when you had emailed me or messaged me, I'm like, oh, is that already? And then I saw, like Lee had put something on there on Instagram, I think with like your guys' cover, but I hadn't seen anything, and you guys were already, putting stuff out. So I totally agree with you. I think it is the bane of our existence, but I also think it's even with traditional publishing and authors, right? Like even though they had paid ads, that's why like somebody like we had on like Scott Drakeford with the Rise of the Mages, like he came onto my podcast. He does a lot of his own stuff because even if you are traditionally published. I was talking to R.R. Verdi about that too, where it's the same thing, right? Like it's just that algorithm is just, even if you pay, it's, tends to not be your friend at times. So I think some people get too get too get too much of a bad attitude about it. Like I think there's almost like there's only so much you can do about it. So I think again, doing things like this, right, or where you and I will message each other on on Facebook or something like that. I think just the again, I always remind people, and it keeps coming up over and over again, the only way to really get anything to happen, I think, is to meet authors such as yourself or editors, or and just meet people organically, I guess, is what I always tell people, whether it's on Zoom like this, or, to go to a con or a seminar or something like that. I'm actually assembling the East Coast Avengers, as I call them, because we got a bunch of authors that are near me that want to do more stuff. And we saw these cool people, and they're doing those cool things out in Seattle, but it's too far for us, So we're going to start to do things on this side. So R.R. Verdi was like, "Hey, I'm going to be at New York City Comic Con." I'm like, I told my wife, I was like, "I don't care what we have to do. We'll take everybody and just go." And I think like James Lloyd Doolin and I had talked about like doing like a table together at like a Comic Con near my mother-in-law's. And then a few other people, like JCM Byrne maybe might show up, stuff like that. CL Snyder. So it's kind of cool, right? I just started asking people like, "Hey, is anybody near me that wants to get together?" And it was funny to see how many people. I think I have like 10 people now, about to put in our group chat this summer, which will be really cool to plan stuff out for the next year. But again, I think that's the only way that you can combat, the algorithm basically. I think I've seen people too spend just like hundreds and thousands of dollars and still not, be successful with the paid advertisement, because I think that algorithm is just so hard. But I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and I was just curious, with it's the Advent of Winter anthology, right? Because there's too many in my head right now.
So the Advent of Winter was the one that Don McDermott did do their Kickstarter.
Oh, so what was that one about? Because I'm like totally blanking. I've seen it and I forgot to look it up before we got started. So what was like your guys' theme for that one, or what was the anthology like about just in general?
I mean, this one, the whole concept behind it that Dom came up with was absolutely brilliant because it was something so different and such a cool way of doing it. The theme of the anthology was winter, so everybody wrote
Oh,
winter themed stories, but it was more the way that it was delivered that made it so different and so cool. So it was delivered as an advent calendar of short stories. So
that's cool.
for everyone who backed it over December, they would get one story per day. And
Oh, that's
then once they
cool.
had all been released to the backers, it was then put together into the anthology, which is absolutely stunning. I mean, that cover is gorgeous.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yep,
it was just such a cool, different way to do a project like that.
yeah. Well, that's like your guys's too with the Anime Fear anthology. Like I thought it was cool that you guys had like the different body parts and stuff were were like into inserted into the stories, as like the anatomy theme. I just think it's just interesting to point out because people talk about Kickstarters, right? And just different things, but it's so interesting that you have thousands and thousands of people doing Kickstarters, but something like what you guys have done twice, right? And very different concepts or ideas, but just makes it really cool. I think it really goes to show it's a great example of what you can do, you know, with an anthology. And just with a Kickstarter, right? There's just so many different ways that you can present it, that it's not like, oh, it's another Kickstarter, and I think like Herman Stewart angle with the Bartender Between Worlds and stuff, like, giving people like cocktail recipes that are actually that the bartender makes and stuff in the book. Like amazing idea, and I think it's really cool to hear that that's how you guys did it. I didn't realize that. I was just like, oh, cool cover, sounds really neat, a lot of people I like, but that's really cool of like how you guys presented it. So I think that's another great example of, if you're creative enough, right, you can do something that people really want. So I think that's really neat. Well, that's awesome. Definitely gonna have to check that out. I absolutely love the cover. So I'm so mad that I missed it originally, so I'm definitely gonna have to correct that mistake. So, but this is gonna be one of my favorite questions to ask so far for this season. So, what genre is the Hallows, and why did you pick this for your genre?
That is a extremely good question, which I am still struggling to answer, even a
Even
few
better.
months after it's released. The genre, I would best describe it as a noir, gaslamp, grimdark comedy, mystery,
Oh,
which
that's
I know is
perfect.
a lot. It's several genres mixed together, and it takes elements from different ones. But I would say at the heart of it is a gas lamp fantasy, essentially. I mean, it's 1920s set, so we're talking the era of motor cars and gangsters and prohibition, and it takes the vibe of the 1940s classic detective, puts it into an urban fantasy setting, gives it a 20s flair, adds a little bit comedy, adds a little bit of whimsy and some monsters, and it's just sort of its own beast. It's a hard one to define, but I think it's a fun one, I think.
I would totally agree. And I asked this question specifically because I always think of the Golden Compass, and people argue about it all the time. And I've literally seen it in young adult, I've seen it in fantasy, I've seen it in sci-fi. And I think that's why so many people have enjoyed it, is that Philip's just like, whatever, I'm just gonna write what I want to write. And I love the Hallows, first of all, because I love that noir, feel. 1920s has been one of my favorite recent ones to go back and study, particularly as I'm reteaching US history and stuff. So it's just so cool to be doing it at the same time as I started the arc. Um, and I'm really excited to further see where you've gone, in terms of different genres that you've mixed together. But yeah, it's just been so cool just to see somebody that's like, I don't care, I'm just gonna write something I want to write and a really good story. But I've seen so many people that have enjoyed it, but I think that, you didn't allow the genre restrictions to restrict your story. So I just think it's the Hollows is a great example of a really cool story and amazing characters that you will get if you just write what you want to write. And obviously the hard part's going to figure out, is figuring out like how to, sell it to people, but who are really, into genres. I'm not into genres. Everybody that's been on here knows that I just want to read a really cool book, and review it and get the next one. So I just thought that it was so cool that you mixed so many different elements together, but you did it in such a great way that you took all those threads and just wove them so tight that I don't think that I've noticed at all that, you're, crossing different genres or something like that. It just feels like one woven tapestry together that tells a really cool story with really interesting characters. So, but I just want to point that out to the audience because I've had a lot of people ask me privately recently about that. And I'm like, just write the story you want to write, and then people will read it or they won't read it. And that's up to them. Some people won't read Brandon Sanderson, right? And that's just fine. And he's over there counting his money. So it really doesn't matter. So I really can't wait to get into talking about this. So, what is your newest release, The Hallows, about, and how did you come up with this idea?
Well, I remembered to bring it with me this time
Such a
because I
cool
always
prepared.
forget. So I'm getting better at this now. So the Hallows, I think for anyone that hasn't seen it on social media or Amazon or any of the places that it is, the best thing I can do is probably just explain the tagline. So the tagline is the thing that's got the most attention on this book, and it is ancient bloodlines, illicit substances, and floating nuns. So that's been really interesting to have some conversations about on social media, particularly the floating nuns seems to get people's attention. But in essence, the story is about Cam, who is our protagonist, who works as an assessor for a company called the Providence Company, which is an arm of an ancient religious organization called the Old Church. And they administer and oversee and kind of legislate the use of a magical drug called a hallow, which bestows different powers and abilities on the denizens of the city based on their bloodline and who they are in particular. So there's lots of different sorts of old bloods, and what they can do is kind of individual. And Cam, his job is to investigate anything where maybe the hallow has had an adverse effect on people, or there has been like a death or some sort of criminal activity involving the drug. And essentially, he's there to protect the interests of the church and the company. And throughout the course of the story, he investigates a number of deaths that have been happening, and he gets caught up in some friction between people who have different ideas and machinations and plans for the future of the city and the drug and the people that it affects. And we just kind of follow his story and see what he discovers. So it's very hard to talk about without spoiling it.
I know I'm trying to like think of subset questions, and I'm like, that's a spoiler. So I think I'm gonna go off script here, and I'm gonna go first with okay. So you talked about like, like this is kind of like that 1920s, like that roaring 20s, kind of feel, not just for the United States, but that was an interesting time in any country, I feel. Particularly, just going with after World War One and the after effects. So in terms of your world building, why did you go with, because this is not on Earth, right? This is going to be, like a different world, right? So I'm curious at why you necessarily went with this part of your timeline rather than a little bit earlier, because there's quite a few things that happened before this, right? In terms of, they talked about. So I'm curious at why you went with this part of your timeline rather than some of those events that came previously. I think I did a good job of not spoiling things, but
No, it's good. It's good. I think for this, what I really wanted to focus on was the balance between the progression of technology and science and the traditional and cultural aspects of the world. So there's a huge amount of world building that I kind of know exists myself as the author, and it does get touched on in the novel. And I probably could have got a prequel or a novel out of that. However, when I write, I always like to look at like societal shifts. So I like to work in periods where there is a lot of revolution, there's a lot of educational and economical progression. And as we all know from history, those periods aren't necessarily always met with welcome arms.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
usually conflict. So, because I had this whole concept of this ancient religions, ancient organization, I really wanted to put characters into a time period where they would be being tested and trying to find that balance between how can they live in a world that is more technologically advanced, how can they live in a world where society's viewpoints and kind of moral compass is shifting, and yet still retain that link and that passion for and the faith that they have. And I think the 1920s is a really good era to draw on that, because it was the era kind of, it was post the Great War, it was going into this, you got your flappers and prohibition, and kind of societal expectations were starting to break down, particularly for people who are more marginalized, people like women. And it was a very difficult thing for, a lot of people didn't want that shift. They didn't want that change. So it was cool to put characters into a position like Cam, where he is stuck right in the middle of those two things and having to make decisions about where do his loyalties lie, where does his perception of the world take him.
No, I think that makes total sense. And that really kind of leads me to the next one, which I just thought you just did such a good job of putting like him in the middle of like the company and the church. Um, so I'm kind of curious at where kind of like where that came from. Because I think that's just so interesting because he is part of the company, but then he also has to take responsibility, for what they're doing, but then also has to help people based off of trying to not give things away. He has to help people based off of his job and his beliefs in the company, but also kind of the church too, right? So I'm just kind of curious at where the idea for the company came from and the church, where you made them separate to put him in the middle, because I just thought that was a really, really good idea.
Where the idea came from originally was probably from watching a lot of documentaries. So I had this idea in my head that I wanted to do something that combined faith, politics, and science. So I knew I wanted those three threads. So
Yeah.
I started watching a lot of documentaries about different religions, different religious institutions, and how they work. So there was one in particular that I watched, which was about a group of nuns who work within, I think it's somewhere in the US. I can't remember specifically where. They also have their own website and they run their own blog as well, which is really interesting to read.
Yeah.
And they all kind of take it in turns to talk about and explain their way of life and how it has changed and progressed. So, the idea of, nuns on the internet and riding scooters and having mobile phones, that kind of thing. It's something that I don't think people tend to think of. Like, we have a very specific idea in our heads of how these places work. We don't
Yeah.
tend to think of the people behind them. So the idea of the Providence Company and the old church was, how does something like that, how does an organization like that survive when the world starts to leave them behind? And it's like most things, is they go corporate. So they start branding, they start marketing, they start trying to reach a new audience in a different way. And I think for Cam, his loyalty is probably not so much to the church itself. His loyalty is to the kind of the core of what they're trying to do. So more the human side of it. So the philanthropy and the trying to work with these communities and do all the good, great work that, people of faith want to do. And I think he finds it a little bit conflicting sometimes. And that was a really interesting thing to play with, that he knows that there is a good thing at the root of most of what they're doing, but he doesn't necessarily agree with all of it. And he doesn't necessarily have that belief in it either.
I connected a lot with I'm connecting a lot with his character because like as a teacher, like I have to give state exams right now. And it's so crazy because now the state is saying that in the future they're gonna eliminate these and then they're not needed in order for kids to graduate. So it's kind of like before we gave the test last week, I'm like, then why are we doing this? Like, we know this really isn't needed. We've been saying this the whole time. There's so many kids it doesn't help, and it actually hurts in terms of their psyche. They're like, oh, I didn't pass this, I'm stupid or whatever. And it's just like, no, you're not. It's just this test is only assessing how well you're doing taking a test, not what your knowledge on the subject is. And there's just so many things I felt like lately I have to do for my job that I don't like or agree with. So I got that. I really connected with Cam on that. I'm like, yeah, I totally get that. So I just thought that was an interesting like piece that you added because I think a lot of people in their roles, jobs, or professions can feel that way, right? I have friends in the United States. Many are police officers, military or veterans, and they've expressed those kind of things. But as well. And I'm like, there are plenty of people I don't think should teach, and I've met some of them, I've worked with them, but at the same time, the best place for me, I feel like, is within the system to try and make it better. And I've had a lot of my friends, in different professions say the same. So I don't know, I really connected with Cam on that level, if that makes sense. And I don't know, I just felt like there are a lot of you did a great job with a lot of making him multifaceted as a character. I'm trying to get better at that myself. So but I just felt like there was a lot of depth there and that I could connect with him a lot. And I've talked to some other readers that have said the same. And it's interesting because like one of my friends was a nurse and she's like, oh, I really like Cam and for these reasons. And it was funny because I didn't even realize till we started talking about the book and him and stuff. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that's why I was connecting with him. So I just thought that was really cool. And I think a lot of people are enjoying the book because they can relate to Cam, in whatever capacity, because a lot of us, I think, feel that way. I think that's just kind of a common theme, particularly when you're not just working for the company, a Providence company, but, the church is there too, so you have multiple directions and, you're being pulled, this way and that. So I don't know. I really felt a connection with him, in terms of that whole thing. So I thought that was really well done. Um, I'm curious at where like the overall like the drug concept kind of came from. Like I definitely see like 1920s, like prohibition and stuff, and just that whole, like people are trying to progress society in multiple nations, right? After the Great War and to try, kind of pull them out of that degradation and stuff. And the roots of all evil, things like that. But I'm kind of curious at where you kind of just came up with that idea that this is going to be a main, one of the main focuses of the novel, and that this is going to be what the church and the Providence Company have to fight against within this growing and changing society. So where'd you come up with that concept from?
I don't really know where it came from. I knew that I had a very clear idea in my head of the concepts and the themes that I wanted to address with whatever magic system I used. So I knew I wanted it to be something that had an element of physicality to it. So rather than it being, a magic spell or, an innate kind of, you know, puffing out clouds of magic or whatever it is people do. I wanted it to have like a physical element, and I wanted it to be a choice as well, because a lot of the book is about the hubris of consequence. Um, I think initially when I first started thinking about the drug use element of it, it was because I wanted something that really worked with that urban setting and that kind of societal impact. So we all know that drugs have a huge societal impact, and there are lots of invisible issues. So you can walk past someone on the street and maybe not know that they've got an issue with drugs or narcotics or whatever it is. So I wanted something that was really visually like impacting, so that people could see, okay, so this person has got an extra arm growing out of their neck now, so they're easily identifiable as a drug user. And obviously, being easily identifiable, it's hard to say, as a
Yeah.
drug user, then makes it easier for people to marginalize those communities, because they can see that they are a part of that group and therefore they can be ostracized or treated in a certain way. Then you've got the other side of it, where they're actually being encouraged to use these drugs because actually they do have a purpose and a use. It's giving them these extra abilities, which obviously benefits the city, it benefits the companies they work for. So it's just showing that evolution of how people view the drug itself and the people who use it. So they're useful, they're great while they're fit and healthy, and this drug is giving them that extra strength, that extra speed, that extra clarity. But then once that wears off or the side effects take effect, they no longer are of use to society, and then at that point they become marginalized and obviously treated as lower class citizens. So yeah, the whole concept of the drug really was, I needed something where I could show people's reactions to it. So whether it was a pill or it was something that people smoked or they sniffed, or whatever it was more important to show the kind of external reaction to it, if that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. Yeah. It's just so funny because I think you just did such a good job of, because I've been going over these themes constantly, because now I have like three different grade levels for social studies, and then I have other courses for like seniors and stuff, with like government and stuff, like US government. And but it's just, I thought you just did such a good job because, as I'm going through, particularly when Cam goes to a certain neighborhood, and those are the thoughts that are going through his head, right? About like 30% of the way through the book, I would say, or 20, 30. But like those are the kind of thoughts that are going through his head, I would say he doesn't agree with, right? Is that, and he even says that to one of the other agents, or local law enforcement. And the guy kind of judges those people. But I like that Cam's like, well, what do you want? Like they have to use the drug to to help them at their job to feed their families. And he literally says it at one point, right? In the company, once they're done, or their industries or factories or whoever, these bosses just throw them away. And I thought, oh my God, like that is so true of any country, right? In terms of either the industrial revolutions. And I just thought that you did a really good job of showcasing that as an enduring issue, which I talk a lot about, with kids in terms of different courses. And we try to show them that some people today, there are companies today all over the world that do the same, right? That once their profit hits, whatever happens to those people happens. Soldiers, I think, is a major one of any country, right? Like we want you when you're young, healthy, and then afterward, we don't treat you very well, and you could end up homeless, despite, what you've helped our society with. So I just think that you just did a really good job of showing that cause and effect within society. So, but I like that you put the drug in there just because, I thought it was different than, like alcohol or something like that. But I did like the physical effects because it was easy for people to ostracize them. But I just thought it was a very cool theme that you went with to showcase in your world, that teaches a really valuable, historical or life lesson. So I thought that was really cool.
Oh, thank you. Just if I could just jump on like one thing you said there, because I just
Yeah,
think
yeah, for sure.
it's a cool thing to kind of um, emphasize as well. Is I talk about the way that the drug affects the denizens, but obviously Cam and his colleagues, they all use the drug as part of their
Yeah.
working life as well. So they are caught in this constant fear of, they know they're going to have these side effects that are going to, physically and mentally, become detrimental to them, and it's going to force them to quit work and not have the benefits and the privileges of being part of this company and this church. And I did draw on, you mentioned kind of police earlier and people who are in the armed service, so really any sort of service personnel. I did draw a lot on that as well, because I think there is, for Cam and his colleagues, this sense of they're constantly in fear of this bullet, the bullet being the drug. And it's the same as going out on the street and being, at risk of, violent crime or being in a war zone. They know that there is a constant risk that they're going to die for this job. They're going to die in service. And when they do, chances are they're going to be forgotten about, because they're going to be replaced by the next person. So they're kind of working for this system, this machine that really devalues and takes away their identity as well, and how they cope with that, and the camaraderie and the spirit they find in sharing that experience with each other.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think that was one of the things I liked so much about the beginning, like two chapters, was that there was a lot of give and take between the different characters, particularly, when they're like back like at their headquarters, or like I guess you would say like their cell's headquarters, or compartment. And I don't know, you just felt like yeah, it really felt like what a lot of my Marine friends have talked about, in terms of, the camaraderie between units, stuff like that. So I don't know, I thought you did a really good job of like showing that. But yeah, I didn't even think about that because from what I've read so far, there is with Cam in particular that constant fear, and he keeps reflecting on that. So I think that that's really cool that you added that because I mean it does make sense, right? I think about that all the time with with different people. I think nurses for us in the United States, it's huge right now, even though the pandemic's, on its, downward spiral or whatever trend. But like, they're still just so overwhelmed. And, I have so many family members that are nurses and they'll have them come in, constantly. But then when they get sick, it's like, I don't know. It's kind of crazy. They do just treat them like sponges, right? And then once, they gotten all they can out of them, they're kind of like on their own. They have to just figure it out. So I have definitely seen that trend, unfortunately, since the pandemic, particular with them. So I think that makes total sense. But it is really kind of scary to think about for Cam though, when you're, you know, just like hearing his thought process about that. And that has crept into my mind, like, well, you must really believe in what you're doing or want to make an impact in order to put yourself at such a negative risk, if that makes sense. So but I think it does make sense when you look at different professions. um but yeah, I don't know, it's almost like a ticking time bomb as you're like going through and reading, if that makes sense. So if your purpose was to stress me out, you did a really good job. So
I'm glad.
I'm sure other people are like nodding their heads there. um Yeah, and in terms of the different side effects, I just kind of want to go in there because we did talk about the physicality of them a little bit. Um, I was kind of curious, like, how did you kind of come up with some of these side effects? Were you trying to come up with like the thing that was most physically alarming or most fearful? Because I got to say, those really freaked me out on the few that I've seen so far within the book. So I don't know, they definitely had like a jarring effect. But I was kind of curious at how you kind of went with those and kind of mapped those out or created those because I thought that they've worked really well so far for me. So
I think it was sort of three separate elements for that side of things. So the first one was, I wanted it to feel like it could be a real reaction that someone would have. So I wanted it to feel like it could be real world. I didn't want, people's heads to explode. I don't want to take it that far. So I started looking at the effects of things like steroids and like roid rage,
oh yeah, yeah.
and kind of what happens to bodies when they have like adrenaline overdoses. So that was one that I looked at. So all these things that just cause a massive like overblown reaction in the body, and how that would affect breathing and physicality and movement. So that was the first thing I did. The second thing was I looked at, so in the book, all the different old bloods have types. So depending on what type they are, then the Hallow will have a different effect. So for somebody who, for example, we have sirens who a lot of their ability is mentally based, it's empathy, it's kind of persuasion. So for them, the side effects are much more cerebral, so much more mentally based. So it could be like hysterical laughter, so they can't stop laughing because everything becomes hilarious. It could be depression. Whereas somebody like Stout, for example, who are the quintessential strong guys, for them it could be, you know, busted up muscles or twisted bones. So it had to make sense for who the person was as well. And then thirdly, I forgot what my third point was. I'm sure it was very exciting. What I take my train of thought back. No, I will come back to the third point when I
That's
remember.
all right. That's all right. I just think that's cool that I feel like you always have like something that you've done or seen, and I just feel like your writing is really analytical. And you're like, oh, how can I use this? But it's always has like a really cool original route, if that makes sense. And then you just kind of divulge from there into this really creative process. So I think that the side effects are really neat just to see where you've come up with those. So I think sometimes right as writers we try to do that, right? And but it gets kind of hard at times. So I think just, doing something like that. I look at a lot of societal things like you were saying, and just different changes, different developments in ancient societies, and then I like to go with what those consequences, both positive and negative, were. So I think, just being able to see the real world around us and what you find interesting, and then find ways to incorporate that into your writing. I just always think that you do that really, really well. So I just thought that that was like a really cool example in terms of like the side effects, but that's really neat. Um, oh, then that I'm so sorry. That totally reminds me because I think I skipped it in one of my subset questions. But in terms of how like your different categories. So we have the strong man, kind of we have like the siren. What were some of the other categories in terms of like the powers that you can talk to us about, or like their side effects? Like how did you kind of classify them that way?
I mean, a lot of them are sort of, I say predictable, but they're like the more traditional powers that you would get in other magic systems, just slightly changed to fit the
Yeah.
world that we're in. So you've got the ones that can fly, you've got ones that can move very fast. And I think because I take a lot of inspiration from like the superhero genre, so I always kind of look at different things I've watched or read. So, you know, you've got like your X-Men comics and you've got Alan Moore's the Watchmen series.
Oh yes.
I kind of look to see, you know, what are the core elements that people always use. So you've always got like your basics, you've got your physical strength, your speed, flying invisibility, things like that. And I remember sitting down and making this list and having different like category boxes for everything
Oh wow.
and working my way around like the body as well. So I was like, okay, what's going on up in the head? What's going on down in the legs? You know, what's going on with like the heart and the lungs and, you know, anything I could think of. And, you know, it was really easy at first because I think I had, you know, maybe 10 or 12 different categories of old type. And then I started pushing past that. And I think by the time I got to about 20 or 30, I was really starting to kind of struggle to come up with, you know, innovative concepts. So, and you know, it's like anything as well. Some of these people have really cool powers that are awesome. Some of them, you know, they're not quite as exciting. So yeah, it was fun to see how far I could push that and still be coming up with creative ideas. I think the hardest thing was naming them.
Oh yeah.
So and trying to have the names make sense. So, you know, your stouts, your sirens, sixers. Uh, some of them I kind of have to explain in the book, but I think some of them are a little more self-explanatory.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's super cool. That's awesome. Um, yeah, I just really liked when like those like different people like showed up. I just thought it was really neat. It was like kind of like reminded me a little bit what like Brandon did with the Allomancers. but like totally different at the same time. But it was cool to have the feel of the roots kind of within. That's why I always kept thinking. I was like, oh, this feels like X-Men, which I think is just one of the best originally written, like series and just world building, just in general. I think that and like the last Airbender, Avatar: The Last Airbender are just like two of the best magic systems, if that makes sense. So I just thought that was like super, super cool. And it felt really reminiscent, but in a 1920 setting, in a different like world, which was really, really cool. So I like seeing that how you did that. I like Warhammer too, with like how they do some of their kind of like magic based systems and things. But to like I'm like kind of trying to do like a blend of that too with a particular project. So it was just kind of cool to see how you did it in like a unique way that kind of got my writer brain thinking like, oh, maybe I could fix things, for myself world building this way. So I don't know. It was just really cool. But it was interesting because I just felt like it wasn't your typical oh, when somebody puts in magic with like steampunk, for instance, or some of the other noir stuff, I just felt like it wasn't kind of like the same old magic system, and it was really unique. So and I just thought it worked. It's been working for me as a reader with the setting and the time period that you picked. So it's like super, super cool. Just because you mentioned it earlier, I'm just curious. Are you thinking about doing any prequel stuff or anything like that? Like a little bit further back, or like with the old wars or anything like that? Or
I don't know at this point. I mean, I have been asked this a few times now, and I've been asked if I'm going to do follow-ups based on the characters in the book. So I won't say which ones, but there's two in particular that I get asked about by loads of people. I say loads of people, loads of the people who've read it. And I would never say never. I think at this point, I have so many projects going on. I don't want to commit to something. I certainly have the ideas there. There is, you know, outlines and plans. And I think eventually it will probably be something I come back to, whether it's a prequel or whether it's a spin off from one of the other characters.
cool.
I don't know yet. But I think there's a lot more in the world to explore. And it being a short book as well, I think there is a lot of untapped uh, character development that I could use. There's a lot of interesting, like you say, the history of the city, the history of the world. That would be cool to explore that some more. So it's a watch this space scenario with that one, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that was my follow-up. If you were gonna do, yeah, like anything with, further characters or anything later, even like time jumps, even like into the future. I just think that you have so many cool, yeah, so many cool elements world building wise. You could really go, I think, anywhere with the timeline, quite frankly, and it would just, or with characters, and it'd just be like, really interesting and unique to read about. So that's really cool. We'll leave it as a question mark for the audience. So I like that. Watch the space. I'm gonna start to use that, by the way. So that's a really good answer. Um, I gotta say, we talked a lot about the world building. I just want to say though that I really enjoyed the world building just in general. It's really gotten me thinking about just like different time periods. And I think like totally blanking. Well, like you and like Crystal Matar. And then I was talking to somebody else a little while back, like last year. I guess it was like a year and a half ago, with their Gaslamp Fantasy that's not out yet. But like, in terms of picking different time periods. I just think it's always interesting to see what people do with the different genres and elements of fantasy. So it always gets my reader brain interested. It gets my writer brain, trying to think, oh, maybe this would be really cool to do at this point in time. So I think that's really cool. And we talked a little bit about the relationship between the Providence Company and the Alt Church, but from like Cam's perspective, but overall, like can you just kind of go into what their relationship really is in terms of the company and the church and how they interact? Just kind of like just like in general, because we know that Cam kind of works in between. But I was kind of just curious at how they overall interact, just for the audience, so they could kind of get a glimpse into that. And kind of like why you went with that as like an integral part of the story.
So the relationship between the Providence Company and the Old Church, I mean, they are essentially the same thing, but it really works in uh, sort of like a symbiotic relationship. So the one feeds into the other. So the Old Church itself has been around for thousands of years. So this is an ancient religious organization. And at the core of what they believe is this idea that you get satisfaction and you get fulfillment and you get joy in life through creation. So they're laborers, they're builders, you know, and it's for them, it's not just about building things to do with their organization. It's in general, they are very encouraging of like traditional building and hard work and sweat and graft and labor. That's their thing. And as the years have gone by and the rest of the world has become more developed, so it's become more capitalist, it's become more business driven, that burden of creation has become a burden. So what they used to find joy in, it's now mass produced. It's now, you know, 12-hour shifts a day, and it's kind of taking away that connection that they have to their faith. So the Providence Company has arisen as a way for them to take back control of that. So even though they are playing into this system that kind of uses and abuses them, they are kind of trying to hold on to a little bit of control over how they fit into the world. So the Providence Company is overseen by the Mother Superior, who is Mother Yasha, and she is probably my favorite character in the whole book. I loved writing all of them, but she is so cool and so ruthless, but at the same time, essentially quite a good person. And it's so interesting to see how people react and how they view her. Some people have come to me and said, you know, she's definitely a villain. She's, you know, she's a bad person. Some people have come and said, you know, oh, she's trying to do good. She's just making the hard choices. And it's really interesting to see, and especially the relationship that she has with Cam as well, because she's obviously the head of this corporate entity that he's working for, and he doesn't necessarily agree with what she is doing. He doesn't necessarily agree with the way she runs the church and she runs the business, but he always throughout the book has this level of respect for her and the pressure that she is under and the difficulties and the choices that she's making. You know, she's having to make choices where she's taking things that are sacred and traditional and, you know, something that she loves very much, and having to put a value on it and make it corporate, make it commercialized in order so that their way of life can survive and thrive in this new world. And she's constantly in conflict with herself and in flux with, you know, these two different sides of the world she's created. And I remember sitting down and trying to write this particular scene right at the beginning of the book, where it's talking about Cam going to the headquarters of the church, the Providence Company, and he walks in and there's nuns walking around who are like heavily armored, so they're security nuns. You've got different factions that work in marketing. You've got ones that work in PR and scientific research. And, you know, you've got delivery trucks coming into the church and dropping off equipment and things like that. And it was just a really cool thing to play with, these two absolutely juxtaposing images, and kind of try to build a world from that.
No, that's one of my favorite scenes, so I'm glad you mentioned that. At least as far as I've gotten so far. Because it just, yeah, it was really cool, and it like kind of made you think. You're like, oh, because like I do feel that like being Catholic and stuff, like there are a lot of people I talk to. I'm like, like most people have no idea what like the religion's about and stuff. Like really, particularly here in the United States with different political entities. And I'm literally like, oh God, I'm like, you've never even read anything about your own religion for most people. And but it's interesting to, well, I've had this talk with priests and stuff like that, and I've said to them, I'm like, they've like talked about how, they're and nuns, how everything's shrinking, in terms of their numbers. And I'm like, well, I'm like, I was always somebody who was like, well, if you guys allowed people to get married, then I would totally do that. And I think again, changing a system from within really appeals to me. And but they're everybody I talked to is like, oh, we're not going to do that kind of thing. But I've had those conversations with people within my own religion, with priests and nuns, about talking about how to update things, or how to see the world today as it is, rather than from a different lens, if that makes sense. So I don't know, that scene just like hit me hard, because I was like, oh man, like I've had these conversations many, many, many times with people within the organization and stuff. And I don't know, it was really interesting, because it really got my mind thinking like, oh, what if what if those people did update things? Or it got me thinking, like, in 200 years, what is it going to be like? I always think of oh Paul Bethany was in like Priest, was like the graphic novel. I love that movie. Wish there was more, and it just makes you wonder, like in terms of a different genre and setting, what those types of people would have to do to change and update with the times. So I don't know. It was interesting because I've seen that quite a few times recently. So I thought that was a cool theme that he kind of went with. And I thought that scene was done really well. I thought it was cool seeing nuns walk around with armor and stuff and talk about marketing and advertising. And it was funny to be in Cam's head for that part and just think like, oh man, things are really changing here. And not really sure. I was really sure like how he felt about it, but just that, you could tell there was a lot of change. So I thought that was really interesting from that perspective. But no, that's really cool. I was trying to find a question that we could talk about those things, but not give like things away. So I thought you did a really good job of answering that
Oh,
one.
thank you.
That was a hard question to come up with, but you did a great job. You did exactly what I want you to do and touched on quite a few things there. So that's really neat. Um, and in terms of, I guess, like in terms of, trying to think of a good way to put it. When it comes to like the characterization for Cam, I'm kind of curious at like what was like your driving force? Like, what was your main goal with having the story really, start off and kind of be shaped by Cam's perspective? I'm just kind of curious at, kind of why you decided to go with him being in the middle of the company rather than being like one of the nuns, let's say.
That's actually a good question. I don't know why he wasn't a nun. I mean, that probably I don't necessarily know that it would have worked because I feel like the nuns, the motivation that they have for doing what they have is very different, and Cam needed to have a specific motivation. So, as I said, there's these three separate threads. So there's the faith, there's the science, and there's the politics. And Cam very much sits in that science kind of box. So everything about his character and his motivation is based on pride. It's based on morbid curiosity. I think I mentioned, this concept of hubris earlier. So for him, it's not about how can he fit within these different elements of the world. It's how can he challenge them, how almost the point where how can he prove them wrong. So his background as a scientific developer for the company, his involvement with the church and his relationship, especially with Yasha and June in the book, it's all about him challenging things. So he doesn't accept things for what they are. He doesn't accept them on face value. He doesn't necessarily trust them, I think, is the main issue. So he he wants to find breaks in the system. He wants to find those weak spots, not to exploit them or to use them, but to prove that they exist. Because he kind of feels like he's sitting in this world where he can see things that other people can't. So he's experiencing, these horrific sights and these deaths and these tragic events that stem from the system that they're all in. And I don't necessarily know that he is trying to break the system from within. I think that he is doing it out of, certainly the beginning, out of the arrogance of wanting to be proven right. He's almost got a bit of a superiority complex in, like, oh, I can see how this doesn't work. I can see why this is bad and no one else can. And I think it's through the course of the book that he starts to soften those perspectives a little bit, and he starts to really understand other people's motivations and other people's reasons for doing it. And that was one of the fun things to play with the relationship between himself and June, who is obviously training to become a nun, is him starting to not accept her faith, but start to understand where it comes from, what the root of it is, and why it matters to her. And then maybe shifting his perspective a little bit from that.
That's cool. I just liked it because I've just seen a lot of people, if it makes sense, like go like have like a character within the old church and then have it be from their perspective. So it was just cool as a writer to see again where he's in the middle really and trying to understand these people. I just thought from a narration perspective it worked really well and I think it gave you more like a greater width for his characterization when you're talking, like learning these lessons and things. And I think we end up getting more of a more full story and understand the world more from seeing it from more people's perspectives, if that makes sense. So I just thought from a writing perspective that that was a really smart move on your part. And it kind of made me think like, oh, like should I move a couple pieces around, or maybe in the future, maybe I could get a better story myself by thinking of things a little differently, if that makes sense. Like somebody doesn't always have to be right within the organization to learn from it or criticize it or make it better, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I just thought it was a really cool perspective and point of view that helped to drive the story. So I thought that was really interesting. So we're kind of wrapping up on time here, Hallie, but I definitely want to make sure we got enough time for that last question for you. So, do you have any news, updates, or current projects, anything like that you can share with us?
I have a couple of current projects going on at the moment. So, for anyone that is in the UK, I have my first author events coming up on the 29th of September, which is going to be in Shrewsbury at a venue called the Nerdy Cafe, which is an absolutely awesome place. It's a really gorgeous board game cafe, really supportive of local creatives, artists, writers. They have like regular writing groups that go in and meet up there. Really cool bunch of people. So, we are currently selling the secure entry tickets on Eventbrite. We also have our website, which is fantasyandsci-fi-spotlight.co.uk. It is a limited capacity venue, so if people do want to make sure that they can secure entry, it is always a good idea to book in advance. And we just have a awesome lineup of panelists, authors, vendor tables. There's going to be workshops going on. There's going to be interviews going
Oh,
on. It's going to be really awesome day. So if you are in the UK and you're available on that day, there is probably no better way to spend your day. In terms of books, I'm working on Vanguard 3, hopefully penciled in for a 2025 release date, hoping to get it over to the editor at the end of July this year. And then I will obviously keep people updated on social media as to how that is going. And after that, we shall see. I don't know after that.
that's awesome. Sounds like such a cool event. I'm bummed I have to work. Wish I could just gallivant over and hang out and play some board games and stuff. But that's really cool. It's ironic because I would say our second greatest viewership and listenership is actually in the UK. So it's funny, you might actually have some listeners head over and check that out. So make sure we put that in the description, where anywhere where this podcast can be found. But that's really awesome. Thank you so much, Holly. I love talking to you anytime we can get you on, and talk about your writing process. Always makes me think differently about mine, which is one of the main reasons that I still do this after 3 seasons, and all this craziness. But if anybody has not read the Hallows yet, I am about 30% of the way done. I'm almost done with work this week, so I'm really excited to be able to just put an end to the school year and finish up the Hallows and a couple other ones that I've been really trying to finish for a while. So my review will be up. Actually, I will send it to you as soon as I get it done. I'm actually starting them this summer, so yours and Mike's are pretty high up on my list. So I have a couple novellas I'm getting up first, and then as soon as I'm done with those, I'll send them to you guys. I'm actually trying to get yours out the same week that this interview goes out as well. So I will send both of those links to you through email. That way you can take a look at those and share those as well. But thank you so much for coming on again. Any other time you want to come and chat, or if you guys want to bring an anthology crew, you just let me know and we'll make sure we get you on. So thank you so much today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. It's good to be back.
Yeah, yeah. Well, can't wait to have you back a fourth time talking about Vanguard. Anything else that you want. Just want to remind the audience you can find all of Holly's social links, books, and things like that in the description anywhere where you're watching or listening to this podcast. We just want to make sure that anything you're reading or watching that you're reviewing that helps out everybody involved. But other than that, thank you everybody so much. Holly, thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I'm sure I'll talk to you soon on social media.
Thanks very much.
See you later. Have a good day. Bye.